Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining today's event, the Logical Operations ITIL 4 course preview. Before we get started, let's go over some quick housekeeping notes. First, I recommend that you turn off any other programs that could potentially take bandwidth, such as Outlook or Instant Messenger. Second, we encourage and enjoy interaction, so please go ahead and submit any questions you might have through the chat or Q&A boxes on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll make sure to address those for you at the end of each chapter, at the end of each lesson. Lastly, today's session is being recorded, and we'll share a link to the recording with everyone who registered for the event. So with that being said, let's get started. I'm Vanessa Welly, Marketing Director here at Logical Operations, and I'll be your host today. I'm joined by Patrick von Schlag, Certified ITIL Expert and Logical Operations ITIL 4 Course Subject Matter Expert. He's going to lead you through the course preview. I also have Amanda Zimmer, Manager, Partners and Alliances, here in the room, and she manages Logical Operations Relationship with People Cert, and she'll be here to help answer questions as we move along. So before we pass it over to Patrick, we'd like to conduct a very quick poll to get a sense of everyone's roles within the organization. So let me just open that up for everyone here. So once that's loaded, you should see that on the right-hand side of your screen. I'm not seeing it here yet. Sorry, one second. Make sure the polling pane, here we are. So I'm going to open the poll, and if you wouldn't mind taking a couple seconds and selecting the group that makes most sense for your role, so we can see who's attending. Oh, okay, great. I see some responses coming in. Very good. So we'll give it just a couple more minutes. Great, lots of responses so far. We'll close in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, close the poll. And it looks like a few of you are still responding for that, so it'll take into account your responses and then show up for us. Great. So I can share these poll results here. So as you can see, it looks like we've got lots of instructors here, a good group from operations, some of you who are in sales, and some owners in here as well. So thank you everyone for submitting your responses. It's great to know the group that we've got joining us today. So at this point, I will pass the ball over to Patrick, who will be leading the course preview.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much for that. And I'm going to go ahead and if you will give me the opportunity, I can share my screen. And I'm just going to share the whole screen with everybody here so everyone can see. And good morning. All right. So what we're going to do, guys, is we're going to start by just kind of doing a high-end walkthrough of the outline and kind of how the course is framed out. And then we'll take a walkthrough of the various slides, talk a little bit about the book and the book structures and how it supports us, and obviously answer any questions that you may have as we go around different aspects of how the courseware works and how to leverage and use it in a way that's going to make good value, create good value for you and for your students. So real quickly, just as a high level kind of walkthrough, the way the courseware is laid out is in 6 main chapters. There's an overview section, and the overview section very much talks about kind of big picture, what is ITIL, where did it come from, all those relevant things, talks a little bit about the differences in ITIL 4. For those of you who may not be instructors in this space, ITIL 4 is very much in the process of becoming, right? And so what you're going to see is that a lot of the guidance associated with this really hasn't been published yet. They've put together kind of an initial foundational level guide for what ITIL 4 will eventually be. But quite bluntly, they haven't published a lot of this stuff yet. So the ITIL 4 Foundations very much is just that. It's providing kind of a leading edge view to where ITIL 4 eventually will be. And ITIL 4 itself is going to be a very significant upgrade over previous versions. The framework is structured differently, and the scope of the framework is much, much different relative to previous versions, really reflecting what's happening in the larger industry, expanding the areas focused on things like agile practices and DevOps, shifting left, lean practices, and a number of other things. So the structure really has 6 main parts, and we'll walk through each of these one at a time. Right, where there's going to be a core overview section, which really lays out the framework and what it is. There's the framework itself, really talking about the 2 main parts of the framework. And then we break out 3 chapters or 2 chapters that really break into certain parts of that high-level framework. It's called the service value system. So we do a specific lesson on guiding principles. We do a specific lesson really on the other core aspects of the service value system. And then we get into the practices themselves. For those of you who are familiar with the ITIL 4 syllabus, it really creates kind of 2 tiers of what are now called practices. And those practices are covered at different levels of depth, and the expectations for the students are different in terms of what their examination expectations will look like. And so we carve out the 7 key practices into the first lesson, and then we do cover the rest of the practices, which are very much kind of an overview level. They're supposed to know the purpose and some key terminology, and we provide them some additional information as well as we go and try to help them get their hands around these various pieces. So with no further ado, let's get in and start looking at this stuff. So the first chapter, and I'll go ahead and share this whole screen up here so you can see it. So the first chapter really begins looking at, kind of core, what is ITIL? Where did it come from? Why does it matter? Right? So if you've worked with students in the past and you've delivered this training before, most people who come into ITIL training don't really understand its scope, don't really understand where it comes from, how long this stuff has been out there. And so we give you some structures to help you in kind of explaining this to your students, explaining what a best practice framework is, explaining kind of the history of how we got here, right? And then giving you a little bit of an introduction to the core organizations that help drive this. So this gives you an opportunity to introduce the IT Service Management Forum, to talk a little bit about Oxalos and the role that they play in accrediting and maintaining and publishing the ITIL, and the role that PeopleCert plays in managing the credentials and managing the certification. We then give you the slide that they've now given us around the certification scheme. Again, for all the folks who are instructors, if you've sat through the Train the Trainer, you know that this is what's coming. Understand that right now we don't really have almost any of this yet. We have the foundation content, and they are in the process of publishing all the actual ITIL books. And that's going to be happening throughout 2019. And so the rest of the credentials that you will make up what eventually will be the various specialist roles, strategy roles, leader roles, and eventually the managing professional and strategic leader paths. All of this stuff is going to happen between now and the end of 2019. So unlike previous versions, I suspect that there will be more uptake of these second-tier ITIL certifications, if for no other reason than the Foundation's credential has been somewhat simplified, and the scope of it is definitely reduced from what you saw in ITIL version 3. This should give you an opportunity to cover some of that content in more detail with your students, and at the same time, not overwhelm them with so much information about so many different processes that they can't recall anything and they don't really come out of there being able to leverage and use that information in a way that's useful. So then we're going to take them through kind of this whole idea of thinking about service management. So you begin by kind of talking about the transformations that are continuing to go on in IT, some of the benefits that come from ITIL and ITIL practices, and then we introduce the high-level framework at a very high level at this level, right? So you're going to go into all this later in more detail. So at this point in the course, you don't really want to cover all this in exhaustive detail, but you do want to spend some time introducing them to the idea of the service value system, the core parts of the service value system, and ultimately that the whole point of this is how do we in fact convert opportunity and demand for services into value that we co-create with our customer, right? And eventually there are a lot of different pieces that have to happen in order for us to make that work. And so the first main part of the framework is just laying out what these core principles are. And then, of course, we'll get into all of this in more detail as we go. Next slide here then kind of walks you through those high-level pieces. So you might show them the diagram and then move to this slide and then just effectively walk them through the various parts of the service value system, high level here. Now, we're going to cover all this in more detail later, but just to give them a sense that basically there's two main parts of the framework. The first main part of it is this notion of the service value system. And then the second main part of it is this idea of the four dimensions. This is a big change. Lots of people traditionally have thought of ITIL as a process framework, right? And you can argue with a lot about that was never really the point, that the point of processes is to help support services and service delivery and outcomes. But a lot of people don't really understand that. And so in order to kind of reinforce this idea, in ITIL 4, they introduce this idea of the four dimensions. In other words, when I consider work and how we create value for customers or work together with them to co-create value, we need to consider all the different dimensions that affect this, right? We need to consider how we produce value streams and processes, yes, but we also need to consider our organizations and people. We need to consider our information technologies. We need to consider how we engage and align our partners and suppliers. And how does all this stuff roll up to produce a whole level of value in terms of the products and services we provision? Then in the framework, they also introduce this idea of PESTLE, various factors that may influence all of these things, political factors, economic factors, and so on. So again, we're going to cover the four dimensions in detail in a subsequent chapter, but you just want to introduce the idea that ITIL really isn't intended to be a process framework anymore. And in fact, the core language changes so that instead of talking about processes, we talk about practices. And the practices then, of course, work across all four dimensions to help us support and deliver capabilities. All right, so then you can kind of introduce the view of the four dimensions at a high level, and then you can use this slide to kind of introduce each one at a high level. What are we talking about? You know, when we talk about information and technology, what do we mean? Right, and then you can just kind of allude to the fact that we're going to go into detail around all of this later. But these are the two main parts of the framework. We have the service value system, we have the four dimensions, and together that's what makes ITIL 4. So then we get into activities. And for those of you who are familiar with existing versions of our courseware here, you'll recognize that at the end of each of these main lesson blocks, we ask a series of discussion questions. And you can use these to your discretion in working with your customer to try to get a sense of how well they're capturing the information, what kinds of feedback or questions they might have, and to help them start thinking about this more practically for them. All right, so the questions that we lay out for this first section, again, appear in the student's book similar to what you see in front of you here, right? And so these might allow you to have kind of a short discussion with your students. Why are we doing this? Why is your organization interested in adopting a best practice framework? How does this help us, right? Is this going to solve all our problems? Of course not, right? We're going to eventually have to be able to adapt this appropriately to our organization's needs. Make sure that they understand the two core parts of the framework and kind of why we have them. And then maybe ask them personally for them to think about their own goals. You know, for a lot of your students, this may be, well, I'm in this foundations class because my boss said I have to go to this, right? And they may not have any realistic understanding of even why they were sent to training in the first place. And other customers may be much more explicit in terms of their organization's goals and objectives, what areas of focus they have, and how this is supposed to help them get value. Okay, so you can use these at your discretion, depending upon how much time you have, how many questions you have as you go, just as an opportunity to have discussions with your customer. And at the end of each of the main lesson blocks, we have these types of reviews. And it gives you an opportunity to go through and have that conversation with your customer, and then to be able to identify places where there might be follow-up questions that you need to do with them. Okay? So once we've gone through kind of the core framework, we then get into some of the core definitions. What is service management? What are services, and so forth and so on. So this actually has a similar feel to how we might have laid out the original sections in previous versions of ITIL. Right, so there's a bunch of core language we want everybody to know. And one of the key benefits of adopting a best practice framework like ITIL is to get everybody on the same page language-wise. So we want to be able to talk about things like what is a service, what is service management, what is an organization, and so forth. And so they've made some modest changes. Okay, notice here that the service management definition substitutes the word enabling as opposed to delivering value. That value happens ultimately as a combination of what we do as a service provider and what they do as a service consumer. Right? They introduced the core definitions of products and services. They have dispensed with the idea of resources and capabilities, and they now describe resources more broadly across the four dimensions. That organizations own these resources, and we configure them in various ways to produce products. And then services then, of course, is how the customer then uses that to achieve some desired outcome and co-create value along with the things that we're provisioning on their behalf. So again, we define what value is, why services co-create value. This is, again, this was the definition of value in other frameworks like COVID 5 and ISO 20000, and they've adopted ITIL in ITIL 4 to really use the same definition here. They define an organization. Organizations can happen at many levels. It could be an individual person, could be a department or division, could be an entire enterprise. And so this is a really nice conversation piece, because eventually you want to be able to talk to your customer about things like, how you perceive what organization you're even representing affect what services you offer, what customers you serve, and so forth. Then introduce the idea of service providers and service consumers. And of course, we all end up playing both positions at various points along the way. In the ITIL 4 guidance, they define different types of service consumers. So they're on the hook for understanding the difference between a customer, a user, and a sponsor. These are basically the definitions taken out of the ITIL 4 Foundation guidance. They do want to understand the relative difference, that obviously they may have different sets of needs. And we want to make sure that we're serving the right people when we figure out who the consumer of that service is. And of course, there's lots of other stakeholders too. And so this gives us an opportunity to talk about who some of the other stakeholders are and what their stakes are in a service. All right. So as a simple example, what are the expectations for an auditing body, or for somebody who's demonstrating compliance and conformance with something? What are the expectations from the community at large, and so forth and so on. They formally define a service offering. So what are the various pieces or services taken together that may meet a particular customer's needs. And then they specifically break that out into three main components. So here we talk about this idea of goods versus access to resources versus service actions. And so some particular service offering might be some combination of these three things. And so this begs good questions like, okay, for a particular service, what might the goods look like? What might the accesses look like? What might be some of the service actions or supports that we might need to offer in order to be able to deliver that capability on behalf of the customer? They introduce the definition of service relationships, and then of course they're not mutually exclusive. Right, so service providers may serve many consumers. Service consumers may consume things from many different service providers. When we provide services, what are we doing? Right, how are we provisioning services? How are they therefore consuming them? All right, so again, we want to be able to describe these roles and responsibilities, and there's a whole bunch of definitions in here that they're going to need to know for the purposes of the exam. Service relationship management then begins to describe at a high level joint activities between providers and consumers. You could begin to allude to things that they're going to see later on as part of this conversation if you wanted to, that a service desk practice might serve as kind of an operational liaison here, that a service level management practice might serve as a more tactical liaison, that a relationship management practice might be more strategic liaison. But eventually that we want to have proper collaboration between providers and consumers, really to make sure that we're doing the right things to help them enable the outcomes that they want. They introduce the idea of a service relationship model. Service relationship models, again, pretty much describe how we act both as providers and consumers. And then as somebody consumes one service, they may then use that to produce other things downstream for their customers and so forth. Talk about the idea of value. They've again enhanced the definitions a little bit. We talk about ownership of costs and risks in the traditional V3/2011 view of ITIL. Here they also acknowledge that when we choose to use a service provider, that's going to incur certain risks, and that means we're going to have to bear certain costs. In other words, the costs of hiring the provider. But at the end of the day, what we're hoping is the quality of the outcomes they're producing and the costs and risks that the service owner takes on outweigh the costs and risks that introduces and how that may affect our ability to get the outcomes and results that we want. Then go through the definitions of things like outputs and outcomes. What was the difference there? Talk about costs and risks. What would it mean to impose these? What does it mean to remove these? As a matter of service, what costs and risks get removed? What costs and risks get imposed? And how do we ensure that they're getting a more optimal value by working with us as a service provider? Then review the ideas of utility and warranty. For those of you familiar with ITIL 2011, very much the same approach here. Utility is fitness for purpose, warranty is fitness for use. No real changes in how this works. And then we create an activity to have you have a conversation with your people about this. Right, so you're walking through the various definitions, who's the service provider, who's the consumer, name some places where you're providing, who is consuming your service, how do they then turn around and produce services downstream and so forth. And so you could have a nice long conversation with a customer. If you're doing a private or on-site class, you could get very specific about this. Who exactly are their customers? And what exactly are the services that they provide and who's consuming it and how do they use that in ways that create value and outcomes for them. At the end of each of the main sections, we're going to have a series of broader reflective questions. And the idea of the reflective questions, again, is to get people thinking less about the exam or the specific content and more broadly around, how do we use this? Where do we use this in ways that are valuable? All right, so here we asked questions around, what particular level of adoption has your organization done related to ITIL? Some people may not have any idea. Other people may be very specific about certain tools they've adopted or certain processes they're utilizing. and this provides an opportunity for them to get some support and feedback. Likewise, when it gets into the 4 dimensions piece, right? What dimension is your organization in? We're part of people and organizations, right? What are the implications of thinking about organizations in different contexts, in thinking about who your customers are, what the services are we deliver, who consumes those, and so forth. All right. So let's take a moment. I'm going to hand it back. Do we have any questions on the first section for us to talk to?
Hi, Patrick. It looks like most of the questions were more based individually on kind of where they are in the scheme of things with the different courses and things like that. So I think we're okay to move on to the next topic from there.
All right, very good. So with no further ado, let's go to the second chapter. So in the second chapter, we lay out the framework. So, again, when you're looking at differences in ITIL 4 very specifically has dispensed with the service lifecycle as kind of the structure around all of this. And instead, they've substituted these 2 main parts, this idea of the 4 dimensions and this idea of the service value system. Okay. So the 4 dimensions piece, as we've discussed it at the beginning, really helps us think about ITIL as not just a process framework, but a way of thinking about how all the 4 dimensions collaboratively work to produce products and services and to enable us to co-create value with customers. All right, so in this particular section, what you're going to do is you're going to walk them through the various pieces, right, to be able to think about how the 4 dimensions work together to produce value. So a lot of organizations have struggled implementing ITIL practices of various kinds in the past because they become too focused on one part of this. They become focused just on the process, or they get very heavily focused on adopting a particular tool like ServiceNow or any of the other ITSM framework tools. Maybe they're heavily focused on a sourcing strategy in outsourcing a certain component. Right? And eventually what we need to be able to do is bring them back to this idea that the 4 dimensions are collaborative, and without really all the 4 dimensions, you're not going to get what you want. Right? And you want to be able to help people think more holistically about what needs to happen to produce and deliver value for customers across all the 4 dimensions. So then we're going to go through each of them one at a time. In the first one, we talk about organizations and people. You might refer back to the definition of organization that we introduced in the previous section, that we want to be able to think about things like roles and responsibilities, think about culture, right? What is the culture around things like knowledge sharing? What is the culture around things like transparency? And how does that either help us or potentially not help us in terms of collaborating and providing different services to customers? From a people perspective, we want to think about things like skills and competencies, right? What knowledge and skills and capabilities will my people need to be able to carry things out? What levels of expertise will they need? And there's a very heavy focus throughout all of this in knocking down silos, right? We can use whatever organizational structure we want, but IT service management is fundamentally about collaboration. Right? And we want to make sure that we create the right expectations that people are working across these teams to be able to collaborate and create results. Then move to information and technology, walking through both information technology for service management and obviously the services themselves. Right? We want to be able to help them think about what tools will they need. Right? And again, this implies that we have to think about the other dimensions. What do our people need? What processes are we trying to support? How do we engage our suppliers and so forth in making sure we choose a technology platform that makes sense? What information needs to be managed? How does it need to be communicated? How does it need to be protected? All right, and then eventually, how do we start engaging with and thinking about technology options in the context of, costs and risks and how we might provision or not provision some particular technology in some particular way. Eventually, whatever practices your organization adopts out of the ITIL framework, they're going to end up making some decisions about what technologies and tools they might need in order to support them. Looking at the third dimension, partners and suppliers, in the ITIL 4 guidance, they lay this out as effectively a long, basically there's, at one end of the spectrum, you have people who are partners who are sharing risk, who are ultimately sharing in the benefits together, and the relationship is much closer and more collaborative. To the supplier end, it's more transactional, that I'm effectively buying something from the supplier, they're giving it to me, and then it's kind of up to me to figure out how I'm going to leverage and use that to go do something. So, understanding where a particular organization relationship fits on this spectrum is important, because we need to understand something about the implications that's going to create for how we engage together. We want to be able strategically to think about, when do we use suppliers and partners? When do we do things ourselves? When is it appropriate to hire somebody else because there's some particular area where somebody has that very specialized expertise, where somebody has economies of scale that we can't really get? And we can note at this point the proliferation of all these, software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service ideas, and how that helps organizations to scale and to also be able to focus on their particular core areas of differentiation. The last of the 4 dimensions is value streams and processes. They do talk about processes briefly in ITIL 4, but you don't hear the word in the same way that you have in previous versions. All right, value streams is language borrowed from Lean. When we think about a value streams combine various activities to produce products and services. And so when we introduce the idea of the service value chain, we combine different activities in different ways to produce different results. Right, and so the question really then becomes how and what activities need to be engaged in, who all needs to do what to produce what results. Makes sense? And eventually, when we map these streams, when we start actually looking at what the activity sequence looks like and what people actually need to engage in to produce results, this helps us identify weak points in the workflow. There can be waste, there can be extra steps, there can be various types of delays, which in the Lean universe we would call lead time. And we can look for opportunities to streamline those things. Processes, the definition has changed pretty meaningfully. So if you're familiar with the ITIL 2011 definition of process, structured set of activities to deliver a particular result, here, very much, they're talking about a set of interrelated activities that transform inputs to outputs. So a process takes an input, does something, and produces some output associated with it. Right? Within that, we then describe a sequence of actions, which is similar to the previous approach to a process. And then the process itself then may get detailed in more granular level. And so they identify the idea of procedures and work instructions. Procedures appeared in ITIL 2011. Work instructions we used to call tasks, if you remember back to the old process model. And so procedures may then describe who all is going to do certain things, and the work instructions are kind of chapter and verse, what are the activities that we're going to carry out. So when we start thinking about the service, what are the value streams that create the service? Who works on that? How does that work? And then ultimately we can start modeling that and start thinking about how efficiently or how effectively that works. One other thing that they've done in the 4 dimensions approach is identified this, what is called the PESTLE model. It's effectively saying that political factors, environment, economic factors, and so forth affect how the various 4 dimensions work together. So we have certain legal constraints on what we're allowed to do. There are certain economic issues that may affect how much we can do. There may be environmental considerations and how not to create waste that would create environmental degradation, and so forth and so on. And that these always affect how we consider and think about what we do. And so at that point, you then go into a discussion around the 4 dimensions. Part of what you're trying to do for students who have already been exposed to previous versions of ITIL is to get them to think outside the process box, right? You want to get them thinking more holistically about tooling, about people, about how they would engage with and align their partners and suppliers, and ultimately, bring a more holistic way to think about the work that needs to get done. So the second main part of this section then introduces them to the service value system. Now, keep in mind, we're going to get down much more in detail in subsequent sections on the guiding principles, on continual improvement models, and eventually in all the practices. But we want to be able to walk them through the service value system at a high level here. Okay, so we begin by introducing the terminology for opportunity and demand. They're not the same thing, right? Opportunity create possibilities that we might be able to do to add value for stakeholders. And then demand is when there's an actual need, right? There's an actual desire from these stakeholders for certain products and services, right? And so there may be opportunities that don't yet have demand, right? And when the demand occurs, then, as a service provider, we're going to be interested in being able to try to supply that demand. Okay, and it's the existence of these opportunities and these demands that then trigger our service value activities. What are we going to actually go do? We'll give them a high-level view of the guiding principles here. There's a whole section to come that goes through this in detail. So don't spend too much time here. But you want to introduce this idea of guiding principles. Now, in the ITIL 2011 guidance, this was all introduced as part of the practitioner. So the practitioner basically took this idea of guiding principles that are really intended to provide overall guidance on how to think about problems, right? Regardless of an organization's goals or strategies, what are some kind of high-level things we should be thinking about and how that's going to help us try to identify, where we aim our efforts in trying to drive improvements to things. And so in the ITIL 2011 guidance in the practitioner, they introduced 9 guiding principles. In ITIL 4, this has been consolidated to the 7 that you see on the slide. All right, so you can give them a really high-level introduction here, but we're going to go through this in detail in a subsequent section. So I would encourage you just to bring them to this next slide, walk them through the high-level idea, and move on. And just let them know that we're going to talk about this in more detail in a subsequent chapter. Okay, we introduced the idea of governance here. All right, then we talk about governance, really kind of capital G governance, thinking about it the way we might think about it in a governance framework like COBIT. Really, it's about how we establish strategies, how we establish policies and rules, right? So guiding principles and continual improvement apply to the entire service value system, right? Likewise, governance applies to everything that we're going to do. So we might use the ITIL guiding principles, we might identify other ones, but we want to be able to ensure we establish appropriate rules for how we as an organization are going to operate. And then the governance activities themselves help us identify more specifically how we go and carry out the work, right? So what, if you go back to the original guidance, we think about this in the context of evaluate, direct, and monitor. Evaluating strategic alternatives, directing actions, and then kind of monitoring performance against those things. In the middle of the service value system is this idea of the service value chain. Again, we will get into this in more granular detail in a subsequent section, but it's important to introduce the idea of these core activities, that we engage in these activities in lots of different ways, in lots of different combinations, in ways that hopefully combine to create or co-create value for the customer. All right, so we can introduce the service value chain as having these 6 core activities. We want to be able to plan things. We want to be able to improve things. We want to be able to create engagements with various stakeholders. We want to be able to design and transition services. We want to be able to obtain and build various components. And we want to be able to deliver and support things. Right, now having said that, This is kind of the substitute for what we used to think of as the service lifecycle. It's nonlinear, and it can be combined in any subset of ways to create value. Likewise, the individual practices don't go in one part of the value chain, but involve a whole bunch of them. And so what they've effectively done is divorced the practices themselves from things that are kind of equivalent to what we used to think about as the service lifecycle. Instead, you have various activities that you carry out in different contexts to be able to execute the practices and deliver certain value for your customer. We then introduce the idea of a practice. This is obviously a big fundamental new idea in ITIL 4, right? And so they describe it as a set of resources designed for performing or accomplishing an objective. You might then refer them back to the idea that resources reflects the 4 dimensions. So I've got people doing things, I have various information and technologies, I have partners and suppliers, I have value streams and processes. And these things are ultimately going to work together to help me do something I want, to deliver some result that's going to help my customer. We then introduce at a high level the idea that there's 3 baskets of these practices laid out in the ITIL guidance. There are some that come from general management backgrounds, some that were specifically developed in the service management industry, and some that are more explicitly technical management practices that have come out of the technology spaces and that we want to be able to adopt in a larger scale way in provisioning and delivery of services. We then have 3 slides that take us through all the practices in the ITIL Foundation guidance. You do not have to cover all this in detail, right? And eventually, of course, you're going to have whole chapters that are going to help us go into these various pieces, right? The important thing to highlight here is that the guidance is much larger than the foundation scope. So of all the practices in ITIL, there's 34 of them, right? They're really only on the hook for a modest subset of those. Right, and so the way we have that laid out on these slides is by using the italics and the asterisks here. So of all the general management practices in the guidance, only the 4 identified ones are actually in scope for the exam. Of the service management practices, again, they've cut the scope down pretty dramatically so that only a subset of these are really on the hook for the test. This doesn't mean there isn't guidance on the others, but it does mean that that guidance is not in scope for foundations. Right? The intent here very much was to provide us enough time and space to actually have more meaningful conversations with the students about the areas that are in scope, and at the same time to acknowledge that there's a whole bunch of other stuff out there that people can and will want to learn about that will help them, to be able to establish these other practice areas as well. We then finish up looking at technical management. Only technical management practice in scope for foundations is deployment. Notice they have separated release and deployment, and we'll talk a little bit more about those practices when we get into those chapters. Okay, at this point, we kind of shift to a high-level conversation about continual improvement. So continual improvement shows up in lots of different ways in the ITIL 4 framework. It's incorporated in the continual improvement model, which is really the replacement for the CSI model or approach. It shows up in the value chain as a fundamental activity, the improve activity, and it shows up as a specific practice that we want to establish a practice associated with continual improvement in particular. Okay, at that point, you're really going to have a high-level conversation with your customers about these. Talk a little bit about governance. Do they know a whole lot about their organization's governance structure? Talk a little bit about the high-level idea of practices, which practices do their organizations focus on, things to that effect. And then we can kind of help them do some reflective conversations about the value chain, about the 4 dimensions. How do these things perhaps work together? Maybe they can start postulating some examples of how they do different types of activities, for example, delivery and support services combined with engaging with customers, combined with things like, perhaps obtaining and building certain components to do a fulfillment activity. right? And then secondly, any particular practices that your organization currently engages in that they may currently engage in as part of their work. Anything from the practice list that sounds familiar to them, just to try to hold the mirror up to them, give them a general sense of what this is. All right. Any questions on chapter 2? Amanda, do we get any questions, chats come in that we need to respond to?
Yes, we did. And I'm going to just mute you, Patrick, while I'm talking because there was some feedback going on. So let me pull those up for us. We had a question about PESTLE, and this came in the beginning when you first talked about it. And the comment was that it's non-examinable information. Is this diagram the only reference to it, or is there more in the course manual? And as you went on, we did see another slide about that. So I think that was answered on its own there. But if there's a follow-up question to that, Rich, feel free to put it back in the chat. And then we had another question that was a little bit more on logistics, but I think it's important that we discuss through the verbal conversation with you. Chuck asked if he had run the version 3 course over 2 days, with the third day being running practice questions and self-study and things like that, and then ran the exam in the afternoon. Any idea on the best way to carry this out with this new class being 2 days? So give me 1 second and I'll unmute you to answer.
Okay. So can you hear me okay now, Amanda? All right.
Yep.
So it's a hard answer, right? So if you ask the Oxalos and the PeopleCert folks, they basically say you can do whatever you want to do, which is not really an answer. The courseware is set up that it's going to take 2 days to run it. Okay, realistically, you can't really run an exam the second afternoon, right? If you really, really, really want to do that, it's really going to impact your ability to do some of the Q&A and to have some of the exploratory conversations with your students. Practically speaking, it's probably a better strategy either to give them vouchers and have them take the exam after the fact, or perhaps to do kind of a practice exam review and examination the third morning. And I understand all the economic implications of that. But it really is not, it's not a 1.5 day class. It's really going to be at least 2. There will be providers in your markets who will extend this to be closer to the 3-day approach that we generally see in the market. For ITIL 2011, there will undoubtedly be people who offer this as 2, right? But from an exam delivery perspective, it's, you can make your own economic decisions about how you want to approach this, but the material is very much set up to be 2 full days. And if your organization is put in a situation where you really have to do it, understand that you're covering almost half the material the same day you would be asking somebody to sit an exam. That seems a little unrealistic from my perspective. It just doesn't give them an opportunity to review and digest that information in a timely way prior to being asked to sit an exam and test against it.
And I'll also comment too that in the front matter of our course, there'll be some suggestions in the instructor edition for different 2- and 3-day delivery scenarios. But the content that's in the book is 14 hours of instruction. So it's really kind of that full 2-day amount of material.
Anything else that we need to speak to? Do we need to talk at all about PESTLE?
I think we're okay on that.
Okay. So just as a larger description, we have not limited the material to only examinable stuff. We have constrained it in most places, but for example, when we get to the practices where their expectation is just to know the purpose, we do cover a little bit more than that to give them some context so the information is useful. Because if they only are just saying, okay, here's a practice, here's the purpose, that doesn't really give them anything that they can use at all. to provide any meaningful context. So we have provided a little more guidance around that. In the same way, we introduce concepts like PESTLE in here, even though they are not specifically examinable. Okay. So now on to the next main section. And this is really specifically about the guiding principles. All right, so the guiding principles, for those of you who have not been through the ITIL practitioner in 2011, were really introduced to help people think big picture about how to adopt and adapt these practices. Because eventually, when people come out of this training, the expectation is that they're going to be able to go do something, right? And their organizations specifically have expectations around, how do we take lots and lots of good ideas out of these training programs and start going and executing and delivering on some of that. So the guiding principles have been consolidated to 7 in the ITIL 4 guidance, and they've been brought forward into the foundation training. Okay, so this particular section goes through the 7 principles, focuses on some key ideas associated with each of them, and provides you an opportunity to engage with your customers to talk about each of them and the roles that they play in helping the organizations kind of keep their eyes on the prize in terms of how they're serving their customer. So the first of these, focus on value, again begins with the customer. Who are they? What do customers value? How well do we really understand that? Right? And eventually you want to get them into a conversation about why services are services. How does this help them co-create value? What do they do with the service that enables them to get some outcome they want? Right? What do they do? What are they trying to accomplish? How does this, in fact, help them offset certain costs? How does this help them improve performance or reduce constraints, to borrow some of the language from ITIL 2011? We may want to talk a little bit about things like customer experience. Right? How does the customer's experience of the service drive their perception of the quality of the service? How much of that is objective? Does it allow me to do the thing I need to do? And how much of it is subjective and how effectively it allows me to finish it? Each one of these 7 principles ends with a section called Apply the Principle. Right? And so in each one of those, we want to be specific. If I want to focus on value, what exactly should I be doing? Right, and so they encourage people to spend time understanding the customer, understanding how consumers use services, focus on it kind of as part of our normal operational day-to-day work, and so forth and so on. And then you can have a nice discussion about this. And again, working with your particular customer, get them talking about how they would understand their customers, how they understand what creates value for them. How would we drive this principle in what we do and how we think about the work we support? All right, we then go through the second principle of start where you are. Honestly, you don't really have a choice. This is where you are. So you kind of begin by looking at what you have. Measurement can affect how people do what they do. And so we introduce the idea of Goodhart's law here. When we actually make a measure a particular target, then people will organize around the target whether or not it actually meets the broad objective or not. All right. There is a very heavy influence in ITIL 4 in moving toward direct observation. This comes from the Agile universe, right? That instead of relying on reports and reviews, we want to spend as much energy as possible doing direct observation. How exactly is this creating value for the customer? In the Lean universe, they call this going to the Gemba, going and actually looking and seeing how people use services, what's working, what's not working. And then applying this particular principle, how much of this can we realistically use? If I'm looking at my existing practices, what works, what's not working? Sometimes we have to accept that we can't use any of it, and we're going to have to throw it out and start over. But lots of times there's existing capabilities, existing information, and so forth that we can leverage and use as we move forward. Okay, next activity is progressing iteratively with feedback. Same basic idea here. I want to break big things into smaller consumable chunks, right? And I want to be able to use this to create feedback loops. As we create feedback loops, We can help that sharpen our saw, if you will, drive better iteration. This again borrows extensively from the Agile universe. I want to be able to observe results. I want to be able to win a little, consolidate my gains, and kind of do it again. So we more formally introduce the idea of a feedback loop, right? Why do we want one? How is this going to help us get information that may drive different decisions downstream in how we do what we do? And then in turn, how do we use that as a source of information that may help us better understand our customers, their needs, and what products or services we should be providing that's going to help them get to the results they want. We then specifically introduce the idea of time boxing, right? The importance of time and the constraint of, of time that's really kind of fundamentally drives how and how much we can really do. Right, and so eventually, again, borrowing from the Agile universe, we want to be able to time box as many of our activities as we can so that we can get feedback more quickly and we can consolidate the efforts. In applying this principle, we introduce the Agile idea of a minimum viable product, right? And eventually we want to be able to kind of think holistically about what we're trying to do, but to begin, right? To break it into smaller chunks, progress a little bit at a time, get feedback, move to the next round. Try to get the highest value things in place first, try to get some feedback on those and use those to drive subsequent actions. Fourth activity is collaborate and promote visibility. All right, again, we want to get people breaking down silos. Right, in order to do that, we have to be intentional. Right, we have to actually look at how we collaborate, how we do information sharing. And people make decisions anyway. And so eventually part of what we want to be able to do is to ensure that we're creating the right level of collaboration to help people function. Right. So this begs questions like, number one, who are the stakeholders? Who needs what information? Right. So thinking back to previous versions of the guidance, we might use something like a RACI matrix to try to understand how information needs to be coming and going. Right, RACIs aren't explicitly talked through in the foundation guidance anyway, but basically, they provide a model for thinking about things like inputs and outputs. Right, who am I supposed to be consulting with, and who's supposed to be providing inputs to me? Who needs to be informed? Who needs what information to make better choices about the things that they do? How does that extend beyond my organization, potentially to suppliers and partners? Right? What information needs to be provided to customers and users? And then we kind of introduce this idea of different levels of communication, right? And that there are different levels of engagement. And this really sets the table for talking about things like the service desk practice later versus service level management practice versus relationship management practice. Right? They're all important. They're all different collaboration and communications models, but they're different communications with different sets of stakeholders for different reasons. Right, and so we want to be able to, as part of our kind of this core principle, to be able to establish the right level of communications with all these relevant people. Making work visible, again, is borrowed extensively from the Agile universe, using tools like Kanban boards to be able to help people understand flow, to be able to identify bottlenecks. We provide a very simple sample here that you can walk through to explain to people how Kanbans work. That effectively you establish your to-do pile, you pull work as you have capacity to do it, and the goal here is to establish pull-based systems that are more efficient, right? That allow us to limit the amount of work in progress and to have broad visibility across all the relevant stakeholders about where we are. Your customers may ask you about tools too. So there's lots of different kinds of tools, of course, that do this, from very kind of large-scale enterprise tools like Jira to tools like Trello that are really, nice and inexpensive for people that are looking for something simple that's going to enable them to do what they do. Again, key principles here. Collaboration means actually knowing who these stakeholders are. Right, so I have to spend some energy thinking about who the various stakeholders are, and then how do I get the right information to them. This certainly has the sound of knowledge management. Now you'll notice that knowledge management is not in scope for ITIL 4, right? But it's certainly fundamental to all of these ideas. How do I get the right information to the right people? And eventually people will make decisions anyway. And so the better quality information we give them, the better they're going to do. Next principle we'll introduce is thinking and working holistically, right? Thinking about the whole. Now, in previous slide, we introduced the idea of theory of constraints, that, when you look at a system holistically, there is a weakest point of the system, right? And if we don't actually organize around the constraint, then even if we quote unquote improve something, that it doesn't improve the overall capability of the system. So we want to understand how systems work, how we actually use the 4 dimensions to create value, and then to understand the complexity of this. How exactly does the system flow, and where are the opportunities where we might consolidate that? And eventually, we can use good automation, and automation becomes part of another principle here in just a minute. But we want to have clarity about how the practices work first, and do we have good collaboration models? Do we have good processes? And you can see the interplay among some of the guiding principles showing up here. Keep it simple and practical. They've updated this principle from the previous ITIL 2011 practitioner guidance. They want to keep it simple, but we want to be practical about what we need, right? So we want to keep the number of steps down to a dull roar. We want to ask questions like, does this step add value? Is this step mandatory in order to be able to get something that we need? Or if then I have to ask questions like, why am I doing this? And at some point we may carve that out. I may have different stakeholders who have different needs for things. And so part of what we have to, again, do is to focus on what is needed in order to be able to produce the value or outcome that's intended. And I want to keep my practices as simple and straightforward as possible. One way I see this practically in the real world is that organizations spend large amounts of energy trying to customize ITSM tools to do lots and lots and lots of detailed categorizations. And ultimately, this is not a value-added option, right? They're much better off going with something that looks something like pure vanilla, right? And if there's some particularly super compelling reason to do something custom, then that's fine. But ultimately, most of the time, you're much better off using something simple and more straightforward. Again, applying the keep it simple process, is this valuable? All right, again, going back to the focus on value idea. Sometimes to make something really simple takes lots of skill and lots of expertise. So they use the phrase, simplicity is the ultimate sophistication, right? People who are really, really great at something make it look easy, but we know it's not easy, right? And we can use this to help achieve quick wins, consolidate gains, and then focus and do it again. Last of the key principles is optimize and automate. Right, and optimizing and automation, again, we want to take them through the idea that you want to clean up your practice first before you start trying to apply automation. Because all automation does is allow us to do something fast. But if it's a bad thing, then we're going to do bad things fast. And so that's not really what we want. And so ultimately, they give us a series of steps. Why exactly they felt the need to do this as opposed to just using the continual improvement model, I have no real idea, since you can all see the parallels here. But ultimately, they do explicitly define steps for optimization that look a tremendous amount like the continual improvement model, because they more or less mirror that, but at the same time are specifically focused around optimizing a practice. Right, going through broad vision, doing current state and future state, engaging the proper stakeholders, executing your improvement, and getting feedback. So again, should look terribly familiar to all of us. Again, automation is great if I know what I want, right? Because machines don't get tired in the same way that people do. And eventually, one of the things I can do is to liberate people from doing low value, repetitive work so they can go do something else that's higher value. All right, so in the key application piece here, you're going to want to emphasize things like simplifying first before you do automation, focusing on value and outcomes. What are we trying to win? How do we make sure we get them there? And noting that these, of course, work very closely with a lot of the other practices, starting where you are, focusing on value, doing this a little bit at a time, getting feedback and so forth and so on, and then trying to be practical about this. What needs to be automated? How do we simplify this in a way to make our services simple and practical? Okay. We then kind of finish up by talking briefly about interaction, that these principles obviously don't exist in silos, that you're not going to use all the principles all the time, but you want to be able to review these and you don't really want to cherry pick them, right? You want to think about the principles holistically, and then you want to talk about the overall value. Why are we doing this? Why is it important to have overarching guiding principles that kind of affect our things? Because again, we're trying to create a perspective in the customer. In general, when you work with your students, most of our techie students are pretty head down focused on what they do, right? And so part of what we want to try to do is open their heads to think about these other things, right? How does this stuff affect my customer? How does what I'm doing produce value and outcomes for them? How do we go about an improvement program that allows us to be targeted and aim, right? To be able to drive those things. I particularly like this second reflective question, if you have time to do it, right? In order to help your customers really get a temperature check on how these guiding principles really work in the real world, you might ask them to do an exercise where they consider, what does it really mean to follow this principle? And what are the risks, or what could it mean if we don't? Right? And this will help kind of reinforce for them, the value of having guiding principles, and also give them kind of their own elevator pitch for why it matters and how to leverage and use these perhaps within their own organizations to start driving perhaps a different perspective on how they do what they do. Okay, Amanda, any questions from the group?
Nope, I think we're all set. Free to continue on.
All right, now how much would you pay? But wait, there's more. Okay, so next chapter. This is very specifically about the rest of the service value system other than covering the section on the practices themselves. So in order to try to make this consumable from a courseware perspective, we needed to take the service value system and break it into pieces, right? And so, some parts of it, require more coverage and more detail, specifically the areas around the service value chain and continual improvement. Then there's the practices themselves, which are virtually like half the course. And then we have the rest of it, right? So we needed to talk about the guiding principles. We need to talk about governance. So we originally had this in a situation where we had all of these as separate chapters, and we ended up consolidating these together instead to try to make it a little more streamlined and to help you as an instructor kind of keep the flow going. So what we've done is we've really combined these three parts of the service value system in this structure here. And so in this particular chapter, you're going to introduce more governance. You're going to talk about the service value chain and the chain activities. And then this is really where we're going to go into continual improvement and start introducing the continual improvement model and how those various pieces work. Okay, so again, we begin by talking about what I often call capital G governance. Lots of people don't really understand the difference between governance and management. And so helping your customer understand, what a governing body is, the high-level governance activities that go into running a governing organization, evaluating strategic alternatives, directing actions, establishing monitoring and oversight, and how people execute the strategy, demonstrate compliance and conformance with the policies and rules. That kind of stuff is often kind of new and exciting to a lot of your students who really haven't seen this. And then we take them through each of the steps. So we introduce the three high-level governance steps, and then we have a slide that you can talk to for each one of these, introducing evaluation, direction, and monitoring, and kind of help them understand, this is what a board of directors does. This is what a senior governing body does. Right? They're trying to figure out, given all the strategic alternatives, what does the organization actually have to go do? right? And then ultimately, how does that get reflected both in the strategy and eventually in the policies? So, when this comes down to the service value system, right, you can go back, if you were familiar with ITIL 2011, the whole idea of the service life cycle was really intended as a governance approach to IT. So the service value system then is subject to governance control. So if I am doing governance as an enterprise and I delegate governance, let's say for IT to the CIO or some senior body, right? This affects the entire service value system. How and who does continual improvement? How do we leverage the guiding principles? How do we carry out value chain activities? How do we execute our practices and so forth, right? And so we want to be able to think about how the governance really sits as an umbrella over all of this and is going to help, color how we use our various practices and what some of the rules might be. Right? And this is especially important in the context of policy alignment. Right? I have to make sure that the things that we're executing comply and conform to organizational policies and constraints. So we then finish up here by talking about high-level guidelines. Right? So we want to be able to think about governance and management, how they collaboratively work together to support this overarching thing called the service value system. Right? And then ultimately that this is intended to be aligned and maintained over time. And so as governance needs change, as the organization's needs change, these things have to continually be evolved as we go. So then you might just have a brief conversation about governance with your customers. A lot of them won't have a lot of direct experience with this. Some of them may more clearly so. So if you have people in your organization who work in IT strategy, you might ask hard questions like, how well does that align to business strategy? Right? What are the governance constraints that they operate under, for example, for information security or for change policy or other kinds of things that reflect organizational level policies and preferences? What are the implications for being compliant with those kinds of things? We then begin to introduce the idea of the service value chain. Now, if you've been following along as ITIL 4 has been rolling out, they have dramatically scaled this up and down as Axelos is trying to figure out how much to make examinable related to this section. They began wanting the students to understand all the potential inputs and outputs, and this created these huge laundry lists of things that they needed to know. That's really, really challenging, and it's also kind of divorced from the specific use patterns. And so they ended up pulling all of that back. Now, there is some content in your book that illustrates these inputs and outputs. It's not examinable, right? Your students don't need to be spending a lot of energy worrying about any of that. But it's there for them to kind of get a sense of, how does information kind of come and go from these activities? So one of the problems people had with the service life cycle is that the intent was, not to be linear, right? The intent when they created the service life cycle was not that we were going to have this nice linear sequence from strategy to design to transition to operations to improvement. But lots of people interpreted it that way anyway. In addition, because they covered the various ITIL 3 and ITIL 2011 processes in the context of these books, people gained this idea that somehow these processes belonged to this one section of the life cycle and not to anything else. Well, none of that's actually true. None of that actually works. And so the whole idea of the service value chain is that when we do almost any kind of work and almost any kind of practice, it's a combination of a lot of different kinds of activities that we're going to put together in different combinations to be able to carry out and deliver different results for different customers. Right? So they came up with this very high level way to think about the core activities that we engage in, and the fact, of course, that we do different combinations of these activities all the time as we go through and we help customers deliver service, right? That within the service value chain, we get inputs in from one part of the chain, we do things, and we produce outputs that go someplace else. And so this is messy right? That there's lots of different combinations of inputs and outputs, that we work together across a lot of these different activities, depending upon the nature of the work that we're trying to do. All right, so then we're going to take them high level through the activities. This is very short, right? We didn't want to tie your hands in the courseware to talking about all of this stuff in any particular granular detail because they haven't been introduced to any of the practices yet, right? So unless they're coming out of ITIL 2011, they already have a credential and they already kind of understand a lot of this stuff. You know, you're kind of putting the cart before the horse if you start talking about how you would respond to an incident across all these various activities. But at the end of the day, you can think of the activities as describing 6 kinds of interactions we have to do things. And that when we go out and actually establish our practices, it's some combination of these activities working together. Right? So we plan things, we improve things, we engage with stakeholders, users and customers and other stakeholders. We design services. We have to be able eventually to transition them out of development and into production. We obtain and build components. This is really the kind of newish one introduced in ITIL V4 that was more or less implied in different parts of V3, but not explicitly stated, that we need to be able to obtain components or build them once we've actually designed them, right? And then ultimately we need to be able to deliver and support things. All right, so it's pretty easy to see that we do combinations of this all the time. We engage with a user stakeholder, and for example, they may call our service desk to report an incident. We may engage with a stakeholder. We may do some delivery and support activities to resolve the incident, and then we may then engage with a practice like service level management to provide incident data and reporting. All right, so there's different types of interactions and different types of engagement models. And you have various inputs and outputs going all over the place. Right, so instead of thinking of this as one set of linear activities, what we do in ITIL 4 is basically say, again, there's 6 sets of activities we carry out, and we do these in all kinds of different combinations based on the work we're trying to accomplish in the various practices. And we want to be able to delineate and figure out kind of what's coming and what's going. What are the inputs we need? What activities do we do? What outputs do we deliver, and who all gets them? So at this point, we encourage you to have a high-level conversation about the service value chain. When we get into the practices, we introduce the idea of the heat maps. This gives you a more detailed opportunity to have conversations with them about, you know, how the various activities participate in the particular engagement of the particular practices. But here, at least you can have a high-level conversation to talk about how the activities would work together. All right, we then kind of revisit this idea of continual improvement. All right, so students may be confused about the fact that improve shows up in 3 separate places. Right, you have continual improvement as a fundamental part of the service value system. We have continual improvement in the context of the improve activity in the value chain. And then later on, we're going to have a whole practice focused on continual improvement itself. All right, so these things are obviously related, right? But we want to be able to talk about improvement in each one of these contexts. How does improvement help the service value system? How do improve activities get engaged as part of the work that we do? And then what kind of practice capabilities would we want as an organization to be able to carry these out? We then introduce what is now called the continual improvement model. This used to be the CSI model or CSI approach. Notice they have added a specific step to take action. All right, so this is the only big difference between this and the V3 2011 version, is that after how do we get there, we actually take action. Not that we didn't really before, but it wasn't specifically articulated in the model. So here, execute the action, and the rest of the steps are very much the same. Okay, we'll then have you walk through each of the steps. Again, we built the courseware assuming that most of the students haven't had some previous flavor of ITIL. If they have, you can kind of go through this fairly quickly and review this for people who are already familiar with the steps. but allows you to walk through the various activities. How do we go through each of the steps? What's really happening at each stage? When we get to the take action activity, again, they don't really get into the weeds too much in ITIL 4 about whether you should use a waterfall approach or an agile approach. There are plenty of agile capabilities brought into the ITIL 4 guidance. There may certainly still be some circumstances where a waterfall approach is warranted for certain kinds of things. And then ultimately, they wanted to put the emphasis here on acting, right? On actually going and driving through and executing the improvement, right? And then ultimately, what is happening at each one of these steps? So if you think about this in the context of the previous guidance, right, it's very, very similar with just a specific call out that says, we're taking action. We're actually going and doing the improvement activity. Okay, the last piece here is that we then take a moment to map the steps in the continual improvement model back to the guiding principles. Right? It's very easy to kind of point at this and say, all the principles relate to all of the activities, because that is a true fact, right? However, there are certain principles that might be disproportionately important in thinking about certain things. So for example, if I'm establishing my vision, I want to be focused on value. I want to be able to establish how we're going to collaborate. I want to think big picture about the whole system, right? I want to be able to optimize and automate. Right, so those things are going to be reflected in, which areas I'm going to focus on first, right? And as you work your way through the various activities in the continual improvement model, right, there's different guiding principles that have a disproportionate role, right? So you won't be surprised, for example, that when we start asking where are we now, figuring out our baseline, start where you are is probably an important principle there, right? And of course, this all makes a lot of just general sense, but helping them think about how the guiding principles work in the context of improvement is important. We then introduced the idea of theory of constraints. So we talked about thinking and working holistically. Depending upon your comfort level with this, you might introduce this idea when you start talking about that in the guiding principles section. So theory of constraints gets specifically called out in the improvement section of the guidance. And effectively what they want you to do here again is to understand the system as a whole and to be able to look for the weakest link. Now, value stream mapping is not in the scope for the exam. We illustrate that this exists in the bullet, but we don't actually go into it in the guidance and we don't go into it in the book, and it's not in scope for your test, right? But it's really where a lot of the theory of constraints work comes from, out of the lean space. And so ultimately, we want to be able to talk about focusing on the weakest link. In any particular process, in any particular workflow, there's always a weakest link, right? And that serves as the bottleneck for the system. When we improve the system, we have to improve the bottleneck. And so, this is an area of emphasis in the guidance because we want to make sure that the improvement is actually improving the whole system, not just a particular piece of it. Then finish up this section by again having them look at thinking about common work and starting to mentally apply the value chain. Right, so which of these activities are kind of deliver and support activities? Which of these activities are engaging activities? Which of these activities are obtaining and building something? Which of these activities are planning activities and so forth? Just to start using that construct to help them think about the work they do. Because eventually, of course, the actual value stream is a combination of a whole bunch of them, depending upon the nature of the work they're trying to do. All right, and then when you start looking at the continual improvement model, this is a good opportunity to have a conversation about how that's really going. What's working in their organization, what's not working, what kinds of things could we or should we do that would help us take that forward. All right, Amanda, how we doing? Any questions from the group?
Nope, I think we are all set.
Okay. Pacing working okay for everybody? Chat in if you need me to go slower, faster, focus on different things, anything like that. I'm happy to spend this time in ways that's useful for you. So please let Amanda and the team know if there's something else I could or should be doing to help you. Okay, so now we get into the meat of everything. So chapter 5 is really the biggest part of this course. All right, this is going to take them through the core 7 practices that get all the extra coverage on the exam. So similar to the ITIL 2011 guidance, there are disproportionate coverage for some of the practices over others, right? Unlike the previous guidance, for the others, they don't want the whole purpose, goals, and objectives and all that stuff. They just want a high level purpose. Here, they're going to want a whole lot more detail, right? But they don't get down into the weeds in quite the same way they did in the ITIL version 2011 guidance, right? So they're not going to go activity by activity, but they do want you to understand a little more granularity about kind of sort of what's happening within each one of the practice areas. So again, they've called out 7 practices. Notice they don't differentiate between processes and functions. And so the practices themselves cross all 4 dimensions, right? So they've called out the service desk as a separate practice from, say, incident management or service request management. Clearly, the service desk plays a role in how we carry out those other practices, right? But they describe each of these as a practice area, and each of the practice areas in turn covers all 4 dimensions in how we carry out and do what we do. So again, we begin this chapter by looking at the practices. So remember back at the beginning, we showed them all 34 of them, and we pulled out and highlighted the ones that are actually examinable. So the 7 key ones are here on the left. The other ones are covered in the next section on the right-hand side, and that's much briefer, right, in terms of just kind of our overall kind of drive-by on all of the ones that they're asking really basic questions on. They will ask questions on almost all of this, right? So if the practice exams are any indication, they're asking a few more questions on the examinable practices on the left, but all the ones on the right are pretty much getting a question each on the test. So odds are pretty good you're going to see like a question for each one of them as you work your way through. So then we go through. So we begin with continual improvement. Now, reminding them again at this point that we've seen continual improvement 2 other times already. We've seen continual improvement in the context of the overall service value system. We've seen continual improvement in the context of the improve activity. We've talked about the continual improvement model. And now we're back. And here we're talking specifically about establishing a continual improvement practice. All right, so this gets into the stuff that we would have covered in the previous version in CSI, right? That we want to improve services, we want to improve processes, we want to drive continual improvement culture across to the organization, and that this needs to be fundamental to how the organization operates, right? So we want to be able to drive continual improvement. We want to capture these. They don't call it out as a CSI register. They call it a continual improvement register, or CIR. It's not an examinable term, but it's something that is in the existing guidance that we'll probably want to use. And then again, driving through these improvement activities. Notice they don't have the 7-step improvement process in here. They don't get into the granularity of all the relevant stuff, but they do kind of call out these core activities that we're going to do. They want you to focus on a few techniques, right? So there's lots and lots and lots of different methods and techniques out there. We provide you kind of a high-level view of some of these here, and we give you a slide to talk to a sample. So we could have probably chosen any of a number of others. We happen to choose SWOT. This is not disproportionately important or particularly examinable, so I wouldn't spend a lot of time here. But just to help them understand that there's different various types of improvement activities, and I might use these to help define my improvement, define my end state, figure out my relative strengths and weaknesses, and so forth as we do it. We introduced the idea of a continual improvement register. This is an examinable term, so they need to know that this is what we used to call the CSI register, right? We're tracking and managing these things. There's no particular structure that we have to use for this, right? I could have one, I could have many, I could structure them in a lot of different ways. The most important thing is that we're capturing these things, right? And that we're actually using this to help sort of drive these things through so we can actually deliver on some of these improvements. We then finish up by looking at the overall heat map. Right, the heat map stuff specifically is not examinable, but it's a great way for you to talk about it with your students. Right, so how do the various activities engage with improvement? Well, we need to improve everything. We need to improve how we plan, we need to improve how we improve, we need to improve how we design and transition things, and so forth. Right, so you can think of improvement really as an umbrella that sits over all of this stuff. Right, and all of our practices, all of our services, all of our parts of the SVS are subject to improvement activities. Right, and so we want to be able, again, to have, at one level, improvement is kind of sort of everybody's job. We want everybody to be focusing on identifying improvement opportunities. And then at the same time, we want to be able to identify a small team that's going to help lead and focus on this. Maybe it's going to develop some disciplinary support skills in metrics and statistical analysis and those kinds of things to help us drive this stuff. All right, and then you go through some questions to kind of walk them through thinking about continual improvement. And a lot of organizations, of course, wish at this, but a lot of organizations aren't explicit and intentional about it. All right, so if you ask them if they have a particular defined practice with specific people who are actually on the hook for it, you may or may not find that, right? And so what does that really mean, right? At the end of the day, of course, it means that we can want a lot of improvements, but if we're not intentional about improvement, everybody kind of does what they do because they're real busy, right? And so ultimately improvement probably doesn't happen because everybody's kind of head down, kind of doing what they're already doing. Service level management, next practice we go through. Setting clear targets. So this really kind of, again, reinforces the scoping change that we saw in ITIL 2011. Service level management is tactical. It's focusing on service level, service performance. We want an end-to-end visibility of the service, and we want to be able to capture and report on service performance against targets. They define SLAs. They do not get down in the weeds in the same way on things like operational level agreements and contracts. Right? They want us to talk about, setting expectations with customers and using SLAs to align and deliver those. They do introduce the idea of a watermelon SLA in the foundations guidance, which really talks about stuff that kind of looks green on the outside, but it's really red on the inside. In other words, maybe we're meeting our targets, but it's not actually doing what the customer needs. And so we want to kind of caution ourselves around that. Just because I'm meeting my targets doesn't mean that it's actually delivering the right result for the client. We go through and talk about requirements, right? How to get requirements from customers, how to align those with targets. They underpin the idea that this, of course, has to be simple business language that the customer can actually agree to. There's a very heavy emphasis here on, as a service level manager, how do we create the right engagement with the customer? And so they introduce this nice long list of questions to get customers talking about what they actually need. Who's doing what work? How does this actually help them? Are there particular areas or times when things are disproportionately important and so forth? And then there are different types of mechanisms we can put in place to get feedback from customers and to use that to drive improvements. And again, iteration is useful here. I want to be able to identify potential improvements, and I want to be able to do it in a way that we can drive iterative value to the customer. Okay, notice here they introduce the idea of establishing metrics. They have dispensed with the 3 types of metrics in the ITIL CSI guidance in ITIL 2011 and replaced that with what they call operational metrics and business metrics. Operational metrics kind of focus on what we used to think of as kind of system or technology and process metrics. Business metrics focus, as the name would imply, on business outcomes, right? And ideally, we want our service level agreements to reflect business metrics. How is this helping them achieve their business objective? Then go through the heat map. And again, here, lots of focus on things like engagement activities, because of course the big idea here is maintaining that communication relationship, as well as establishing and planning for how and how much service we're going to deliver. Certainly relationships with the rest of the parts of the value chain, not quite at the same level of detail. We then go into change control, right? Notice they've changed the purpose. The purpose here is maximizing the number of successful changes. They want us to be able to successfully assess risks, but they really focus this on being able to be agile, to be able to maximize change, right? To be able to have some practices by which we can authorize these and to be able to maintain and manage a change schedule to improve visibility. Notice the definitional stuff here for change authorities. They do find this examinable. I want to be able to identify the appropriate authority for different types of changes in organizations that are working their way toward DevOps practices. These are often decentralized, and in lieu of using traditional approaches like a change advisory board, they may have peer review or other practices that they use that serve as their gates for being able to introduce changes. So that they formalize the definition of change. Looks very much like the definition from ITIL 2011. Scope can be identified by whatever organization it's in, which is kind of where we were before, but the scope here is very, very wide. Anything that could effectively or indirectly affect a service. Right, and we want to be able to establish appropriate controls for that. Then introduce the 3 types of change. That's the same as in the previous version. Notice here that under normal change approaches, that there is an emphasis on talking about organizations doing DevOps type stuff. That if I'm working in kind of a continual integration, continual deployment approach, that this may be very decentralized, and a lot of the change control process that was more manual inspection in previous versions is more automated in this version. They specifically call out the change schedule in ITIL 4 as a way to communicate and collaborate across the various stakeholder families. Right, we're using this to plan and to be able to create visibility for kind of what's going on and providing information to support incident response activities or problem management where needed, and obviously to identify improvement activities as we go. So again, when you look at the heat map here, real strong relationships, of course, with practices like or activities like design and transition, delivery and support, creating readiness. We may obtain and build various components that we're going to be introducing. And obviously, a lot of these changes are about improving things, right? Improving service value, improving practices, and the like. Okay, we then get into incident management. All right, this looks a lot like traditional incident management. They don't give us the same level of detail around the activities here. So you're not going to go kind of blow by blow through categorization and prioritization and diagnosis and escalation, but they are going to focus, of course, on what we're trying to do in incident management, right, is to classify, prioritize, and then actually ensure that we're working on the things that are highest impact first. Okay, we go through the formal definition of an incident. This has not really changed, except that an outright configuration item failure does not count as an incident unless it impacts users. Right, so an incident really has been kind of reinforced to be about the customer, about the user and the user business workflow. Okay, the incident describes the impact to the user, not the technology piece. Right, the incident doesn't happen to a tool, it happens to a person who's trying to do work and can't do that work in various ways. They get into talking a little bit about tooling here. They want your tool to be able to link to other things. So they are definitely kind of reinforcing what we see in integrated service management tooling. They want them to know that there are capabilities in those tools like automated incident matching, that it is probably not going to provide detailed information about diagnosis, but it's going to provide you kind of high-level steps for being able to coordinate and manage the routine ones. Notice again, they call out things like major incidents and information security related incidents as perhaps getting separate procedures. So major incidents have separate procedures, Information security incidents also get separate procedures potentially in this situation. Okay. Incident diagnosis and resolution. Again, a lot of they have in the current guidance, they've really brought in the idea of user self-help. They've described the various teams and the roles that we might play in diagnosis and resolution. They specifically call out the potential for escalation to things like a disaster recovery situation. Right? If I have a very large-scale incident that's causing huge business impact, that might actually be a continuity situation. That we might establish some temporary team to work a major incident. So I might have a major incident response team, right? How will we collaborate with our partners and suppliers on these relevant things and so forth? Okay. So again, it's interesting because they don't really talk about processes themselves at all, really very much in ITIL 4, other than just kind of generically as part of the 4 dimensions. But here they do talk about incident management as requiring a formalized process, right? Again, we're not going to try to get into incredibly detailed procedures for all the various incidents, right? But we do want to be able to do this in a way that streamlines it, makes it more efficient, scripting to capture information, try to be able to resolve the most routine ones, right? And again, investigating more complex incidents is probably going to take more than what I have in my knowledge base. And we're probably going to have to work around a lot of different things. Okay. If I'm working with third-party suppliers, which means almost all of us, how exactly are we going to collaborate with them? Right? What kinds of coordination needs to happen to get them in the game? And then there's a technique out of the Agile universe called swarming. We did give it a separate slide here because a lot of your customers may not be specifically familiar with this. But the idea, again, is to bring together a number of different people from different technical perspectives to look at an incident and quickly be able to determine who needs to work it. This is really useful because this gets rid of incident ping pong, where people start bouncing incidents back and forth from group to group. And instead, we can bring enough people together quickly, look at the incident, try to figure out who really needs to be working this. Everybody else can go away, and the people who need to be working it can drive it from there. Again, you won't be surprised to see incident management's heat map, including delivery and support, because that's a big part of what we do. And of course, engagement, because we're generally working with users who are having these incidents and collaboratively working to help get them up and running. Service request management, notice the name change, right? So rather than calling it request fulfillment, the name of the nomenclature is service request management. But it generally, again, the goal here is very similar to what you saw in the request fulfillment process in the previous version, right? We're predefining the activities. Generally speaking, we want a nice, coherent, clean procedure to follow. Right? In the previous guidance, we described this through a standard change, and that's really still the case here. We formally define a service request. This should be some agreed action that is part of normal delivery. In other words, it's supposed to be part of my service level agreement, that this is something that we're supposed to be doing. And again, it could be a request for an action, could be a good, could be access to resources, could be some particular support or service action that needs to take place. All right, so this could include things like requests for access, feedback, compliments, complaints, and so forth. All right, so there's a very heavy emphasis in the guidance on automation here. We want to simplify these practices and automate as much of this as we can get away with. Try to set realistic expectations for fulfillment and deliver on that pretty routinely. Again, the heat map looks just like incident management. Core part of delivery and support. Obviously, lots of direct engagement with users and customers as we go, and other relationships with some of the other parts of the value chain as well. The service desk practice formal definition is to capture demand for incidents and for service requests, right? And to serve as our coordination across, right? So we want to be able to the role has matured over time. All right, so this is very much a coordinator and communicator role, helping the people, helping the business get stuff dealt with in various forms. Right, they may or may not be particularly technical. So they don't get into the weeds on how technical a service desk should be. It's going to be very different for different shops. But at the end of the day, to really lift up the role that the service desk plays in customer satisfaction and understanding the context of the business and helping to make sure that the right resources get allocated for things. So they formally define it here. It is still very much treated as a single point of contact. There are many different models. They do not get into the various types, similar to what we saw in the ITIL 2011. All right, so they talk about centralized and virtual things, but ultimately that there's lots of different hybrid combinations of service desk. They don't get into the service desk types like you see in the ITIL 2011 guidance. Instead, they spend more energy talking about things like access channels. How do you get access to information? Of course, this could happen through the phone. It could happen through a service portal. Somebody could have like a chat or a chat bot. You might have walk-in for bring your own device support of various kinds, text messaging, social media, many, many other approaches, right? So the question really becomes what engagement models make sense in the context of your particular customer? And then ultimately, what skills, competencies will they need to be successful? What tools will they need? All right, so we spend some time going through the various kinds of tools they might want. Again, you'll see alignment here with incident and service request. Core areas of heat map here are delivery and support and engagement, right? There's obviously relationships with others as well. And then last, we go into problem management. Problem management looks a lot like we saw in ITIL version 3, 2011. Interestingly, they've actually brought some things from ITIL version 2 back into problem management here to help us identify and get rid of things. So the definition of problem really hasn't changed. Notice the definition of known error has, right? That they really have focused on, root cause. The problem has been analyzed and hasn't been permanently resolved. Some things may live as known errors forever. We distinguish between incidents and problems, similar to what you've seen in previous versions. In this particular guidance, they break it up into 3 phases: problem identification, problem control, and error control. And then we'll take you through each one of those. We talk a little bit about workarounds. Sometimes that's where we're going to live because the error can't be removed for some reason. Okay, error control, we're really trying to find the error and get rid of it. We then kind of finish up by looking at some of the practice interactions. Problem management obviously has close relationships to incident. It also has close relationships to a number of the other practices, many of which are not in scope for foundations, right? And so we want to be able to think about problem management as really an extension of things like knowledge management. How do we get the right information to the right people, and so forth and so on. Okay, lastly, the heat map here. Problem management is largely about improvement. Finding errors, making them go away, or at least improving the quality of our guidance. And obviously, it's a fundamental part of delivering and supporting services for customers. Okay, so then we finish up with just some review questions, just to get them thinking about the differences between incident and problem, the needs for a specific improvement practice, and so forth. So Amanda, I know I've seen lots of things flying around here. Do we have outstanding questions we need to deal with?
Yes. Can you mute your mic real quick for us, Patrick?
I can try to do that. I have to go find where that is.
Oh, here, I got it.
Okay, thank
you. So, sorry, I cut you off a little bit there. We do have one question that I think would be best if you answered, and it is in regards to the heat map that is being shown at the end of each of those sections. They want to know what is the purpose for those. So give me 1 second and I will unmute you.
Okay, so the heat maps are included in the new guidance really to reinforce one key idea, which is that each of these practices does not exist in one part of a life cycle, but has effects on lots of different activities that occur at lots of different points in time. So the heat maps describe, again, a relationship between the practices and the value chain. So the value chain is 6 activities that happen in many different combinations, right? We plan things, we improve things, we engage with stakeholders, we design and transition things, we obtain and build things, we deliver and support things, right? And so when I establish a practice, let's say incident management, for example, yeah, it has relationships with these different activities in different ways. We're obviously doing some delivery and support work. We're doing a whole lot of engagement with customers and users and stakeholders, right? And then we have other relationships with other practices, right? So we may, for example, provide incident reporting and incident data that will be used for service reporting, right? And we may identify incident data that may indicate the presence of a problem that needs to be investigated. So the whole idea behind the heat maps is that it's not a one-to-one relationship between the practices and some activity in the value chain. That in fact we work across a number of the different activities in the value chain. And in fact, of course, the improve activity, for example, or the improve practice has a strong heat map with all the parts of the value chain because everything is subject to continual improvement.
Thank you for that. As we enter in our last 10 minutes of our time together, please feel free to continue asking questions in the chat and the Q&A, and we will answer those as we finish up.
So the last section here is short and sweet, folks. So I know you'll be glad to hear that since we're running out of time. So let's take a look. So this last section looks at the other practices that are covered in the guidance outside the ones that get all the extra attention. Right, so going back to our previous conversations, there are 3 baskets of these practices in the guidance. Stuff that comes from general management, stuff that was kind of grown up and born in service management, and things that were specifically developed as technical practices that help organizations actually carry out and execute the technical pieces of this. Now, for the purposes of the exam, they just need to know the purpose. That's all they need to know. And in some cases, there are certain terms they need to know. All right, what we've tried to do is to keep this short, but at the same time to give you enough context to at least talk about it a little bit, to give them a general sense of what it is and why we would care about this. So relationship management is really the ITIL 2011 flavor of what we used to call business relationship management. Right, and this is looking more holistically at establishing and maintaining, strategic and tactical customer relationships. Right, so the relationship management practice is really focused on the stakeholders, on trying to understand how we create value for them and to keep them happy in the long run. So you see the defined purpose. That's what they really need to know for the test. What we want to be able to do is really just kind of briefly talk with them about what it is and why they might care about that. Information security, again, their core need is to be able to establish this purpose, protect the information, understand and manage risk, provide confidentiality, integrity, and availability, authentication, non-repudiation of things. All right, and so again, we've provided a little bit of high-level support for establishing controls, prevent, detect, correct, that this is very much driven by people. Right, so again, you can provide them a really short overview of these practices and then again refer them from an examinable perspective to the purpose. They need to know what the purpose is. Supplier management, similar approach, right? We want to ensure the suppliers are managed appropriately. We want a nice, coherent, managed relationship with them. We have included on here some activities and supplier models. It's just good talking points. It's not examinable. Right, but stuff that they probably want to have a general sense of in the context of how would I establish a supplier management approach. So those all again come out of the general management universe, right? Those are not unique to IT. Those are things that happen in all other kinds of business organizations too. These are specifically around service management practices. So service configuration management, you'll notice that they have split service asset management from service configuration management. So they want you to know the definition of a configuration item. They want you to know that this is really about information and providing information about the configurations to the other key practices that need that information. And then again, they kind of track all the relevant places where we might get that kind of information. We've introduced a really simple service model, came out of the Axelos guidance that helps kind of give them an idea that a service has lots of parts to it, right? And eventually the job is really to figure out, all the connective tissue, right? And ultimately, how does all this stuff work together to produce this whole working service? And a big part of configuration management is understanding these relationships, right? How do these things work together to help us really operate at the service level? We then introduce asset management. IT asset has a formal definition. They need to know that for the test, and they need to know the purpose to plan and manage the full life cycle of the assets. Notice they are on the hook for value maximization of the asset, not just tracking it, but actually maximizing the value of it, which begs some really good questions, like how do they actually do that? How do we make sure that the assets that we purchase actually get in the hands of the people that need it to go do what they need to do? And then we do kind of include this piece on the activities. That's kind of nice to have stuff. Again, they really need to know the purpose. They need to know the definition of an IT asset. Monitoring and event management, they've pretty much changed the name, but not a whole lot of the rest of it, right? So the definition of an event is the same. They want you to be able to monitor the various aspects of a service, the various components of the service. They call out specifically information security events here in a way that maybe it's a little disproportionate relative to what we've seen in previous versions of the guidance, and to try to figure out response actions, right? So again, they want you to know the purpose. They want you to know the definition of an event. Okay, I then kind of walk through some key activities at a high level. I think it's really useful for most people to kind of get a sense of this. They don't need to know this for the test though, so don't spend too long on it. Likewise, they have split release management from deployment. Release really describes some version of the service or configuration item that is being made available for use. It may be made available for use as we deploy it, or it may be made available for use some meaningful time after we deploy it, depending upon whether we're using a traditional waterfall model or whether we're using an agile model. Okay, and so we introduce the basic ideas of a release, that it may be some combination of hardware and software and documentation and data, that we want to be able to make these things available for use. And this is really about readiness, right? How do we make sure that people are ready to use the service so that the proper knowledge transfer and training has occurred? So they call out the differences between doing this in the traditional waterfall approach and doing this in an agile approach. In the waterfall approach, deploy and release kind of happens together, right? We push stuff into production as we release it for people to use it. In a more DevOps type approach, I may deploy it, but I may hide it behind a feature flag, or I may hide it in some AB version of an environment, and I may only release it when it's ready to be released, right? So maybe customer training needs to happen, or other kinds of readiness activities need to happen before I make that feature available for use. So deployment becomes part of the kind of routine work of putting all this stuff in place, but I only make it available for use when it's time for me to leverage it and use it. So at this point, you can have a brief review of the various service management practices, and then you finish up by talking about deployment. So deployment is the actual physical work of moving new or changed hardware or software into production. So ITIL does not differentiate between hardware provisioning and software deployment. It's all deployment to them, right? Again, you can deploy in different ways. For the purposes of the exam, they just want you to know what the purpose is. And obviously the mega trend in the Agile DevOps universe is to separate deployment from release, to deploy things when they're ready, right, to get them kind of hid behind feature flags and staged, and then to turn them on when they're ready for use, when the customer is ready to catch the ball, right? This makes deployment much more routine, reduces our overall risk, and improves our agility. So we then kind of take them through that brief conversation of what we just went through, that deployment is really changing in the world, that Agile DevOps approach is really focused on making deployment part of the routine pipeline of work and kind of keeping that stuff moving. And then you have some last questions, and that's really the end of it. So any questions on this last chapter?
So I didn't see any come in, Patrick. I think we are good to go there. But as we give people a few minutes to think of those last questions, I do have a couple things I thought maybe you and I could kind of talk about in regards to the actual book and the materials that someone would be getting as they purchase that from us. So the slide deck, as you've been showing, will be provided to our instructors that purchase it as an editable PowerPoint deck. So any of the content that is not accredited can certainly be personalized or changed for any of the instructors that get that. And then the other thing I wanted just to point out on some of those slides as you were going through them, there was some blue text at the top. And that, could you talk a little bit about what that means?
Sure. So the blue text in the text particularly identifies definitions that are examinable, right? And so we've used the formal definitions from the guidance in the slides. So that really provides a straight line for the student to try to figure out which terms they need to know, which definitions they need to know. One other thing we've done in the courseware is we've provided in the Mastery Builders 2 complete sets of additional practice questions. So there's a total of 80 additional practice questions in addition to the formal practice exams. So you're getting the 2 official practice exams from Oxlos, and then you've got another 2 practice exams worth of content that you can provide your students to give them an opportunity to check their knowledge, to be able to track and manage how they're doing what they're doing, so that they get a good sense of what they're going to need to know for the test.
Thank you. And Patrick, if you have it, can you pull up the courseware? I want to point out that special star icon that we've added.
Can you see the 4-star on your screen?
Yep, I can.
Okay. So in a lot of different places in the courseware, folks, what we've done is try to call out the areas where there are specific distinctions with ITIL 4. Because there is no bridge, because they're asking all the people who've taken ITIL 3 and ITIL 2011 to resit, right? We've tried to highlight in the courseware specific areas where there are differentiations between ITIL 4 and previous versions, so that provides a nice quick place for somebody to look, say, what's different in this particular version of how they've managed this definition. So the changes in the definition of service, or the changes in the definition of an incident, and so forth.
Thank you. And one of the other things I'd like to point out if you're familiar with the logical operations courseware and specifically our choice content, you'll know that on our choice platform, the digital key that you get when you purchase content redeemed on our choice platform gives you a couple additional things in addition to your book and your slide deck. That's also where you're going to find your self-check assessment questions for your students. And then we will have post-release 8 different value-added spotlight videos that go along with the content as well. So keep an eye out for those. They'll be there as well. And that's also where the sample papers or the practice exams will be housed also.
One thing I'd just like to tell you about the way we've tried to put this course together is that, previous versions of ITIL felt very much like a forced march, right? That there's just lots and lots of content to cover, and there was no time to really talk with your students about almost any of it because we were so busy trying to get through things. Here we're trying to strike a reasonably good balance between helping us get through the material that we need to, but at the same time providing you a meaningful opportunity to talk with your students about the content and about how and where and when to use it in a way that's going to be useful for them. So I'm hopeful that you'll actually really enjoy teaching this class as well.
Thank you, Patrick. I haven't seen any other questions come in, but we'll give it a few minutes to see if anything else comes through. Oh, I will mention there are a number of questions on when the course will actually be available for purchase. That will be very soon. Your account reps will let you know when it's available, and or keep an eye out on the store for it. I'm sure we'll be shouting it from the mountaintops when the time comes, so you'll know. And in there, with the follow-up to this session, we'll be sending out the link to the recording as well as a PDF of the pre-release of the course manual. The slides will not be included, but those would be what you would get when you purchase the course. So Patrick, thank you so much for your time. We'll stay on for just a few more minutes. I know we're already over time, just to see if there's any additional questions. We thank you very much for your time.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm happy to wait and see if we have additional questions.
Well, I don't see any further questions coming in, so the contact information for myself and for the Logical Operations sales team is on your screen now. If you think of any questions that you wanted to ask us, please feel free to do that. We wish everyone a happy Valentine's Day. Hopefully you fell in love with ITIL 4 today. And if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out. And Patrick, thank you so much again for your time.
Thank you very much.